Do you hear me? Get your things and leave. This house isn't yours anymore.
Yeah.
You've got 10 minutes to clear out everything you own.
Unaware I had just inherited $671 million, my husband threw my clothes off the balcony. What he did not know, what no one knew, was that 48 hours earlier, I had received a call from an estate attorney in Savannah informing me that my great-uncle Elias Bowman, a man who had quietly accumulated commercial real estate, patent holdings, and tech startup equity across 6 states over 52 years, had passed at the age of 89, and that I was the sole named heir to an estate valued at $671 million. And here's exactly how it all happened. The morning of that Tuesday had started the way most mornings started for me. Before the sun was fully up, a travel mug of black coffee on the passenger seat of my SUV. A set of structural blueprints unrolled on the kitchen table the night before and already memorized by the time I drove away. I was a civil engineer, had been since I was 26, starting with small municipal infrastructure projects in Decatur and building steadily to a point where my firm now managed urban development designs and transportation corridor planning across the Atlanta metro. I drove an SUV that had 72,000 miles on it. I wore steel toe boots with dried clay in the tread. My business cards were plain white with black text, and my consulting company name in a font I had chosen because it was clean, not because it was impressive. My great-uncle Elias had raised me on that philosophy. The man had worn coveralls to meetings with venture capitalists. He had driven a 1992 Ford Ranger until the transmission gave out at 300,000 miles. He had once told me I was 22, home from my first year of graduate school, complaining about a classmate who bragged about her father's hedge fund connections. Baby girl, the person who needs you to see what they have doesn't have as much as they want you to think. The person who doesn't need you to see anything is the one you want to pay attention to. I had written it in the margin of a structural dynamics textbook. I still kept in a box in my home office. I had married Derek 6 years ago. He was sharp and socially magnetic, the kind of man who knew how to work a room the moment he walked into it. He had come from a family with middle-class roots and a great deal of ambition, which I had admired. He had wanted a life that looked a certain way, which I had understood. What I had not fully recognized until recently was the difference between building a life and performing one. The first sign had been small and easy to explain away. A cologne I didn't recognize that appeared one winter and was gone by spring. A text notification I glimpsed once from across the room. A first name I didn't know. A message preview that was just warm enough to register and just brief enough to dismiss. I had not said anything. I was not a woman who spoke before she understood the full picture. The second sign was larger. In March, I had come home from a site inspection in Sandy Springs to find the house unusually clean, a candle burning in the living room, and Derek on the back porch with his phone pressed to his ear, and his voice pitched low in the way it got when he was managing something. He didn't want interrupted. He had hung up when he heard the door. He had come inside and asked how the inspection went. I had told him it went fine. In the inside pocket of my work jacket, folded neatly and slightly worn at the crease from being refolded too many times, was a letter. It had arrived 6 days ago from a law firm in Savannah. I had read it twice in the parking lot of a building supply warehouse, sitting in the cab of my SUV with the engine off. Then I had folded it back up and driven to the site. I had not yet told Derek about the letter. I had not yet told anyone. The one detail I had not missed in all the months of watching and noting and filing things carefully away was the small outdoor security camera I had installed above the garage door 3 years ago, after a contractor's toolbox was stolen from a neighbor's driveway. It was angled to cover the front approach of the house. It recorded to a cloud account in my name only. I had not checked the footage in weeks. Standing on the sidewalk with my blazers at my feet, I thought about the camera for the first time in a long time. I picked up my clothes from the sidewalk with the same methodical patience I applied to everything else. I folded them. I placed them in the back of my SUV. I drove to a hotel in Midtown, checked in for 4 nights, and set my travel mug on the desk beside the window. Then I opened my laptop. The cloud account for the security camera stored 90 days of motion-triggered footage. I started at the beginning of the window and worked forward, not rushing. I was looking for a pattern, not a single moment. Engineers looked for patterns. A single data point was an anomaly. A pattern was a structure. I found it by the fourth night of footage. A black sedan, late model Georgia plates, appeared in the driveway. Camera's peripheral range on 9 separate occasions over 90 days. Never parked directly in front. Always arriving after 7 o'clock in the evening. On nights I had worked late or been on an overnight project in Macon or Columbus. The sedan left before morning each time. I ran the partial plate through a vehicle lookup service I had used before for vendor verification purposes. The registration came back to a woman named Vanessa Rollins, 34 years old, a commercial real estate agent based in Buckhead. I noted the name. I kept watching. On footage from 8 weeks ago, I caught a clear frame. Vanessa Rollins walking through the front door of my townhouse with a key. My face remained perfectly calm. I moved to the financial records. I pulled up the joint checking account and went back 12 months. What I found was not dramatic in any single instance. It accumulated the way structural damage did, slow and invisible until the load shifted. A transfer of $1,500 to an account I didn't recognize in February. A similar transfer in March. A weekend hotel charge in Athens from April that coincided precisely with a weekend Derek had told me he was visiting his college roommate in Savannah. I built a spreadsheet. I entered every anomalous charge by date and amount. When I totaled the column, the 12-month figure came to $28,600. I photographed the screen. I forwarded the bank statements to my business email. I moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all of my actions. I searched Vanessa Rollins' name alongside Derek's on every public platform I could access. Most of his accounts were private, but a mutual acquaintance had tagged both of them in a photograph from a rooftop gathering in June 8 months ago. 3 months after I had driven away on an extended project in Macon. They were standing 2 people apart in the frame. That distance was more careful than friends. It was the distance of people who had agreed on something. I drove back to the townhouse the following morning. While he was at work using the key I had made no mention of keeping. On the desk of our shared home office, tucked beneath a stack of GQ magazines and marketing brochures, was a manila folder. Inside it was a consultation summary from a family law attorney dated 14 weeks prior. In the margins, in Derek's handwriting, was a preliminary division of assets he had mapped for himself. The townhouse was listed as a shared marital asset. My consulting engineering firm was listed as potentially subject to valuation. At the bottom of the page in his handwriting, check if she has retirement accounts. I photographed every page. I replaced the folder exactly where I had found it. I drove back to the hotel, sat at the desk beside the window, and opened the letter from the Savannah law firm for the 3rd time. I read through the full valuation summary. $671 million in commercial real estate, technology patents, startup equity, and liquid holdings accumulated and carefully structured over 5 decades by a man who had worn coveralls to venture capital meetings. The estate had been established with the specific intention of passing intact to a single named heir. The heir was me. Under Georgia law, it was classified as separate property in its entirety. I set the letter down on the desk beside my travel mug. I picked up my phone and called a number I had held in my contacts for 6 years without needing it. "Monique," I said, "I need to sit down with you. Bring the Bowman estate file and your family law associate. I'll explain when I get there." Monique Harris had managed the Bowman family's legal affairs for 15 years. She had worked directly with Uncle Elias in his final decade, and she had spent those years learning that the Bowman women communicated in facts and patience and very few words. I was no different. She spread the estate documents across the conference table in her Savannah office and walked me through the full picture with the unhurried precision of someone who had been preparing for this conversation since the will was drafted. The $671 million was not a round number for effect. It was a conservative valuation based on current commercial property assessments across 6 states. Tech patent licensing agreements that had compounded quietly for 20 years, and liquid accounts that had been managed with the steady discipline of someone who had never needed to impress anyone. A single commercial building on Peachtree Street in Atlanta was worth more than most people would earn in 5 lifetimes. Derek's name appeared nowhere in the estate documents. It never had. Uncle Elias had met him once at a family gathering in Savannah 5 years ago and said nothing to me about him directly. He had 2 weeks later quietly revised the single clause in the will, specifying that the inheritance was to pass to me as my sole and separate property under any circumstance, including divorce. Monique had drafted the revision. She had not asked why. The inherited estate is entirely protected, Monique said. He gets nothing from Elias's holdings regardless of how the divorce proceeds. And the townhouse? I said. You purchased it before the marriage. The title has always been in your name only. He never signed on to the deed. Derek had assumed otherwise. I had never corrected him. I drove from Savannah to my Aunt Cora's house in Adairsville that same afternoon. Cora Bowman was 66 and the last of Elias's generation still living, a retired university professor who had watched me grow from a quiet girl with a protractor and a measuring tape into a quiet woman with an engineering firm. She met me at the door with both hands around my face and held me there for a moment before she let me inside. She had sweet tea already poured. She did not wait for me to explain. Your uncle told me, she said, about the will, about all of it. I sat. I wrapped both hands around the glass. He also told me about your husband, Cora said. I looked at her carefully. He was old, but he was not careless, Cora said. He hired someone about a year before he passed. She had been moving things around, trying to find the door. She believed you had more than you showed. I was quiet for a moment. She wasn't wrong that there was a door, I said. No, Cora said. She just didn't know she was already standing inside what she was looking for. She set down her glass and looked at me with the steady patience of a woman who had seen a great deal and mourned the right things. Your great-uncle used to say, she began, that you could tell the character of a person by what they reached for when they thought nobody was watching. She paused. He was reaching, baby. He just reached in the wrong direction. I drove back to Atlanta that evening and went to work. The next morning, I met with my corporate attorney, Marcus Webb, in his office on the 15th floor of a building on Peachtree, a building that, as of 67 days prior when the estate transfer had been processed, was one of 5 Atlanta area commercial properties that now fell within the Bowmans of holdings I had inherited. I initiated a formal review of the joint account, documenting 12 months of transfers as a complete financial record. I had Monique's family law associate file a preliminary protective response to a divorce petition that had not yet been formally submitted. A clean, precise measure that ensured Derek could not make a single asset move without it being immediately visible to opposing counsel. Then I placed a quiet call to the commercial property manager who handled the building on Peachtree where Vanessa Rollins's real estate brokerage kept its office. That building, as of 67 days prior, was one of the properties I now owned outright. Vanessa Rollins was a tenant in a building that my husband's wife now owned entirely. A certified letter went out the following day informing Rollins that her lease renewal, due in 30 days, would not be extended. The letter cited a portfolio restructuring under new ownership. It included the name of the new owner. I made a note. I filled it. I went home that evening. I had called Derek that afternoon, told him calmly that I was going to collect a few more things from the townhouse and that I hoped we could handle the situation like adults. He agreed in the tone of someone who believed he had already won. I made dinner that night. I reheated a pasta dish he had prepared earlier in the week. I ate at the counter. He sat at the table and looked at his phone. He asked if I had found a place to stay. I told him I was managing. He did not look up. I washed my dish. I said goodnight. I drove back to the hotel and slept soundly. Some things, when they were already built correctly, did not require noise to hold. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at Monique's associate's office on Peachtree Street. It had been framed to Derek's attorney as a standard asset review preceding a no-contest divorce filing. Derek arrived at 9:08 a.m. with his attorney composed and deliberate, and wearing the navy blazer he wore to presentations he intended to control. Vanessa Rollins was not present. She had been informed the previous evening by certified letter from the property management company that her lease would not be renewed. The letter cited a portfolio restructuring under new ownership. It provided the name of the new owner. She had, by Derek's account when he called her after reading it, said very little and hung up. I was already seated when they came in. Monique sat to my right. Marcus Webb, my corporate attorney, sat to my left. The Bowman estate files sat on the table in a gray folder, closed. Derek's attorney opened with a standard recitation. Duration of the marriage, shared assets, the marital residence. He referred to the townhouse as a jointly occupied marital property. He mentioned the joint checking account. He referenced my consulting engineering firm and stated his client's interest in a fair valuation. I let him finish. Monique opened the gray folder, placed the first document on the table and slid it across. Derek's attorney picked it up. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He set it down and looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he had been told to prepare for. Derek reached over and took the document himself. I watched him read it. I watched his eyes stop on the valuation line. I watched him read it again. I watched the understanding move across his face, not all at once but in stages. The way light shifts when a cloud moves and you realize the day was darker than you knew. $671 million, Monique said, is the current assessed value of the estate. Maya inherited from her great-uncle Elias Bowman, who passed away 13 days ago. The estate was established and held entirely in the Bowman family trust prior to this marriage. Under Georgia law, it is classified as separate property in its entirety. It was not commingled. It was not contributed to the marriage. Her name is the only name on it. It always has been. Derek set the document down. Monique placed a second document on the table. This is the deed to the townhouse. Will note the title was transferred to Maya's name in the year she purchased it, 3 years before the marriage. Her name alone. She paused. He has never been on the deed. Derek looked at his attorney. His attorney was reading. Monique placed a third document on the table. This is a 12-month financial summary of the joint marital account, documenting $28,600 in transfers and charges your client made to accounts and expenditures not shared with my client and not disclosed to her. We are not pursuing recovery. We are placing it on record. The room was quiet. Derek's attorney said he would need a moment to consult with his client. Derek was not looking at him. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, stripped of the social precision he carried everywhere, reduced to something raw and unguarded and too late. He said my name. I looked at him without anger, without satisfaction, with the same expression I had worn on the sidewalk when my blazers landed at my feet. He said, I didn't know. I let the silence hold for a moment. You didn't ask, I said. That was always the difference between us. I stood. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up my phone and my keys. I looked once at Monique, who gave me the smallest nod. I left the room without looking back. The hallway was cool and quiet. The elevator came immediately. I rode it down alone, walked through the lobby and stepped out onto Peachtree Street into a morning that was already warm and full of ordinary motion. Cars, pedestrians, a construction crew working on the facade of the building across the street. I stood there for a moment and watched 2 workers set a steel beam into place with a level and a torque wrench, tightening it down until it held. I drove to the site inspection in Sandy Springs and checked the structural progress on a retaining wall my crew had poured the day before. It was clean. The angles were true. The drainage channels ran exactly where the plans called for them. I drove home. 12 months had passed like water moving over something permanent. I had moved back into the townhouse 3 weeks after the mediation. I had repainted the living room a deep warm clay color, pulled up the carpet in the back bedroom and replaced it with wide plank hardwood I had sourced from a Bowman commercial property redevelopment in Savannah Heart Pine. reclaimed from a building Uncle Elias had purchased in 1978, wood that had held the weight of generations before any of the trouble that had come and gone. I had built a new deck off the back of the house over a long weekend in October, working alone in the early morning before the heat settled in, each board set level and true. I stood on it most evenings now with a glass of water and watched the light leave the sky. His name was David. He was a landscape architect with a firm in Midtown. We had been introduced at a professional association dinner in December by a mutual colleague who had made the introduction without fanfare or particular intention. He had opinions about native plant species and asked me questions about stormwater management that required me to think before answering. He had not performed for me once in the 5 months I had known him. I was not in a rush. He appeared not to be either. The first phase of the Bowman Estate's commercial portfolio restructuring was complete. Monique had assembled a management team in Savannah to oversee operations. The patent licensing was under new long-term agreements. The commercial properties in Atlanta, Savannah, and Charlotte were fully leased and managed. I had established a foundation in Uncle Elias's name focused on engineering and design education for young women from working-class families across the Southeast. The first cohort of 18 was already enrolled. I heard about Derek through a mutual acquaintance in the spring. He had left Atlanta in February, relocated to Nashville to take a regional marketing position that paid considerably less than the role he had left behind. The townhouse sale had netted him nothing. His name had never been on the deed. The joint account had been closed at mediation. His attorney had extracted him from the process with minimal exposure and considerably less compensation than he had mapped out in his own handwriting 14 weeks before I had photographed those pages. Vanessa Rollins had relocated as well. Her brokerage had folded within 90 days of losing the Peachtree office. She was last anyone had heard doing independent consulting from an apartment outside Charlotte. No firm name, no associates listed. I heard all of this in the time it took to walk from one end of a site inspection to the other. I filled it in the same place. I filled everything that had already been resolved back and down where it belonged. I was in the workshop behind the house on a Saturday morning when the early light came in low through the single east-facing window. I was sanding a piece of walnut I intended to use for a small side table, moving with the grain in slow, even strokes, turning the wood in my hands until the surface was smooth enough to hold the finish properly. A blue jay moved through the oak at the back of the yard and was gone. The workshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and the particular quiet that only comes when you're building something with your own hands, for no other reason than because you want to see it exist in the world. I had been thinking about Uncle Elias all week, not in a mournful way, but in the way you think about someone who taught you how to see things clearly. He had been gone for over a year now, and I still found myself reaching for the phone to call him about structural loads and foundation depths, and the particular satisfaction of a joint that fit without glue. He had never been a man of many words, but the words he had spoken had always been the right ones. "Baby girl," he had told me once when I was about 12 years old and upset about a school project that hadn't turned out the way I wanted. "A thing doesn't have to be perfect to be strong. It just has to be true to its own design." I had carried that with me through graduate school, through the early years of building my consulting firm, through the marriage I had entered with hope and left with clarity. The design of my life had shifted, but the structural integrity had held because I had built it on a foundation that did not depend on anyone else's approval. I set down the sandpaper and ran my palm over the walnut surface. Smooth. Ready. I could already see the table it would become. Simple, clean, lined, functional. The kind of piece that didn't need to announce itself because it did exactly what it was supposed to do. My phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from David stopped by the site on Peachtree. "The rain garden is holding beautifully. You were right about the drainage slope." I smiled. It was such a small thing, that text, but it was the kind of small thing that added up to something real. He didn't text to check in or to perform interest. He texted because he had seen something he thought I would appreciate, something that connected to the work I cared about. He had spent the morning on a project we had designed together, a mixed-use development with integrated green infrastructure, and he had sent me a quiet update because he knew I would understand the significance of the rain garden holding. I typed back, "Told you, never doubt the slope." 3 dots appeared, then, "Never, dinner tonight, I'm grillin'." I looked around the workshop. The walnut was ready for finish. The new deck was solid under my feet. The house behind me had been painted and repainted and filled with furniture I had chosen for myself. Not for the way it looked to visitors, but for the way it felt to live inside it. The foundation I had established in Uncle Elias's name had its first graduating class in 3 months. The commercial properties were thriving. The patent licensing was on track to exceed projections. I had everything I needed, more than I needed, and I had arrived at this place not through luck or entitlement, but through the same patient, methodical attention to detail that had guided me through every project I had ever undertaken. I typed back, "Dinner sounds perfect. I'll bring the sweet tea." He responded with a thumbs up and a fire emoji, which made me laugh. He had a particular talent for using emojis in a way that felt authentic rather than forced. It was one of the small things I appreciated about him.